Good evening, and thank you to the Kochi Biennale for having me. For the last 4 years, I've been trying to think with the Kochi Biennale not only as an event, but also as a place from which to theorize, about the global South and its imagination. And this title could very well have been Thinking the World of Kochi, because I do think the world of Kochi. It's a city that is marvelous in its cosmopolitanism and so on. But what we need to do here, or what I am going to do here, is to think from a particular conjuncture that we are in. Right? We think about the age that we live in no longer as the Holocene, but the Anthropocene. We have seen the devastating effects of human interaction on nature, on human interaction with humans, animals, and so on, and we stand, as it were, at the edge of a precipice. We have to think with a sense of urgency about the world that we may or may not leave behind for our children. And in that sense, when you think about art, we always think about art as an excess. Art as something that stands beside and above the urgency of the present and of the contemporary. But there's something about the Kochi Biennale which is very engaged with the idea of the end of time, that we live in end times, that we stand at the edge of an abyss. And so that is the first word that we need to think about to concentrate our mind, that we are indeed standing at the edge of a precipice from which we have a choice. We have a choice of retreating, we have a choice of jumping over, or being unconscious like lemmings and going over the edge with hardly a space or time for reflection. So thinking about climate change, thinking about history, thinking about art, thinking about Kochi. And here I would like to think with the work of the German literary critic and philosopher Walter Benjamin. I put up a long quote there. I've highlighted what you need to read from that. Having taught for many decades, I know that people don't read everything and that you need to actually package it for them. So please read only what is highlighted in red. The rest of it is just to fill up the slide, as it were. So now, why do I think about Walter Benjamin as somebody who allows us to think with a sense of urgency, to think about a sense of history, and also to give us a sense of what we need to do? Benjamin lived in an era when the Nazis were coming to power. He was theorizing about history and civilization, the wrong place, the wrong time, and indeed, the wrong ethnicity. For a Jewish intellectual to be thinking about civilization when the Nazi Reich imagined that it represented civilization, and for those of us who live in India now, these are resonances that are very urgent and immediate for us, where we are ruled by a Hindu majority government which is actually recasting the imagination of India, where it's imagining India as a nation that is inhabited by and dominated by a particular imagination that is the imagination of the majority. So back to Benjamin. Benjamin, writing about Europe at that time, was very conscious that he was writing about a civilization that was fragile. Right? We tend to think about European civilization in that vast continuity from Greece to the present, but at the point that Benjamin was writing, and indeed the Frankfurt School to which he belonged, they saw that entire civilization as a brittle, fragile thing which could crack under the majoritarian, narrow, parochial forces of the Nazis. And he imagined himself as writing from the edge of an abyss, and this was indeed very prophetic. Because Benjamin realizes that he can no longer survive in Germany as a Jewish person, and he begins his peregrination with an incomplete project, the project that he's then working on the Parisian arcades. So he has a vast series of notes that he's taken. It's a project that he intends to finish, but he knows his time is running out. And so he carries this vast project in his head, an archive of everything that has been thought about European civilization in the late 19th century, thinking about the city, thinking about consumption, thinking about luxury, thinking about history. And he makes the move to cross the border into Spain. But as he reaches the Spanish border, he gives up hope and commits suicide on the border. And we do not know what might have happened had he crossed the border. We do not know what he might have written. He did not know then that European civilization wasn't going to end, that it was going to reinvent itself after the end of the Second World War. But one thing that he left for us was this idea about urgency and about thinking with a sense of the urgency of history and the idea of the abyss into which we are peering. But in one sense, Benjamin is also asking us to be reflective of this, because as he says, there has never been an epoch that did not feel itself to be modern in the sense of the most eccentric and suppose itself to be standing directly before an abyss. A desperately clear consciousness of gathering crisis as something chronic in humanity. And every age unavoidably seems to itself a new age. So when we ask ourselves about the sense of urgency, we have to also ask ourselves, is this a conceit? Is this an artifice? Is this something that we need to propel ourselves into a new imagination of a world that will come into existence? A world that seems to be dying, and are we to aid in its death, or are we to project a future? So is this a mere conceit, an idea around which to hinge our sense of the possibility of survival? But how are we to think this? And in some sense, when we think about Kochi, Kochi is literally at the edge of the world. It stands at the end of India, as it were. It stands at a place which is where the land becomes the ocean. And if we think about Kochi, we are also thinking about millennia, right? We're thinking about time that began with the Roman Empire, the trade in pepper, where Carthage paid tribute in pepper to Rome during the wars that were fought between those two empires. We're also thinking about Kochi as standing somewhere in between Malacca, the port of Malacca in Southeast Asia. The ships used to come across the Indian Ocean, round the peninsula, come to Kochi, go on to Venice, to Amsterdam, and so on. There is a huge world that Kochi is part of, even as it is merely a point on a map somewhere. There is a Chinese map of the 8th century which shows you the Indian peninsula, and the only place that is mentioned is the port of Kollam, further south. So when we think about Kochi and we think about the continuity of its portness, as it were, a port is an opening into the world, we also have to remember that Kochi was not always a port, right? And here, what I've put before you is an excerpt from Ma Huan's account of the travels of Zheng He, the famous Chinese eunuch admiral who sailed the seas and mapped the seas in the 14th century until the Chinese Empire decided that they did not need to know about the world anymore. And the Chinese voyages ended, and then the Portuguese voyages began, right? So the Chinese, at one point, stood poised on the edge of discovering the world, and then they just retreated due to an imperial decree. And this is something that we need to think again when we think about this as a metaphor of the closure of the mind that always confronts us. So in Ma Huan's account, Ma Huan travels in the 14th century, late 14th, early 15th century. But Kochi at that time this is a chapter on Kochi and Calicut and the ports along the southwestern coast. But Kochi was not always that port. In 1341, the river Periyar overflows its banks, covers Krangan or Muziris, and suddenly Kochi becomes prominent. So Kochi gets its place in history through the flood, through the ocean and the river reclaiming the land that humans have clawed away from it. And this is this idea of interaction with nature that we need to bear in mind, that this has been a constant tussle. All it needs is a typhoon, a cyclone, or as happened last week, where Peru, one of the driest places in Earth, receives 6 years of rain in the space of a week. And suddenly you realize that all of this hubris of civilization hinges on our non-conquest of nature, that we always have to contend with this one thing that can take away the achievements. Kranganov is flooded, buried, and it becomes a subject of an archaeological excavation, and Kochi is created. So we have to think about the ocean, living as we do, as Malayalis, at the edge of the world, or the edge of the Indian Ocean world. We have to think with the ocean. And here I would like to put before you the work, or think with the work of the artist Mari Velarde, who displayed her work in 2014. She works in Geneva and produces something called the Atlas des Îles Perdues, so the Atlas of Lost Islands, dated 2107, a time that is to come. And in this room, which is covered in blue, there are portraits that she's drawn, sketches of islands, islands that exist, islands that have ceased to exist, islands that will cease to exist. And by 2107, all of these islands will be under the ocean. So when I walk into this room, when any of you walk into this room, what you're seeing before you is the past, present, and future on the wall, where the world has been flooded, right? And the world is flooding. The flood waters are rising. And there has to be that sense of urgency. And this is where, when I first came for the Biennale and I walked into this room, I thought this is an image for me to think with when I think about the times that we live in, the urgency that we need to have, because the world is not going to exist for us to dominate over, and for us to be irresponsible towards forever. So the Atlas des Îles Perdues 2107 talks about a passage of time within a static frame. The islands that exist, the islands that will vanish, and the islands that have already vanished. So we are left with ignorance and hubris, the two qualities that humans possess in ample quantities. In the Mahabharata, in the epic Mahabharata, there is an episode in which the 5 brothers who are banished to the forests are wandering through the forest. It is hot, they are tired, they are desolate, disconsolate, they do not know where they are going. Their 14 years of exile, this is somewhere at the beginning. And they come upon this little pond in the middle of the forest, and the 5 brothers stoop to drink. But suddenly a spirit arises from the water and says, "Not until you have answered my questions will I allow you to drink, otherwise you will die." I wish I could do this in class, right, when I'm teaching. Unless you answer my questions, you will die, but it doesn't happen. So one by one, the brothers begin to drink. They lean down at the water, they drink, and one by one, they die. Until the eldest brother, who is the embodiment of dharma, Yudhishthira, the embodiment of righteousness and wisdom, decides that, look, this is not a good strategy. So he tells the yaksha, the spirit, ask me those questions. And the yaksha then proceeds to ask him several questions. One of the questions that he asks is, what is the greatest crime of humanity? And Yudhishthira provides a rather simple but an extremely profound answer. He says ignorance. Because human beings are thinking creatures, they can know. But when they choose not to know, that is the greatest crime. He doesn't say murder, he doesn't say lying, he doesn't say thieving. Because all of these, as you realize, come out of the refusal to think through something. So again, when you think about the world and the end of time and where we stand right now in this historical conjuncture, can we afford ignorance? And what does it mean to deny climate change? What does it mean to put to an end an environmental protection agency? All the things that you read about in the newspapers that are going on around us. But this ignorance is not just the ignorance of politicians, it's an ignorance that is deeply embedded within our imagination. And Amitav Ghosh, in his great new book, The Great Derangement, Climate Change and the Unthinkable, has this to say. In a substantially altered world, when sea level rise has swallowed the Sundarbans and made cities like Kolkata, New York, and Bangkok uninhabitable, when readers and museum goers turn to the art and literature of our time, will they not look first and most urgently for traces and portents of the altered world of their inheritance? And when they fail to find them, what can they do other than to conclude that ours was a time when most forms of art and literature were drawn into the modes of concealment that prevented people from recognizing the realities of their plight? Quite possibly, then, this era, which so congratulates itself on its self-awareness, will come to be known as the time of the great derangement. And these are urgent words, these are prophetic words, these are also chiding words. Because the entire book, which is based on a series of lectures that Amitav Ghosh did at the University of Chicago, is asking the question, why is it that we banish reflection on the urgency of our times to science fiction. Right? It's science fiction that talks about disaster, about dystopia, about the destruction of the world. But that is indeed what is happening before our eyes. And why is it that we refuse to address this? This is the crime of ignorance that Yudhishthira spoke about. And if the world is going to end, in Hindu mythology it says it's going to end as a result of the flood, the pralaya. It's a fire next time in Christian mythology. Here it's a flood. And here is where we begin to think about how Kerala was created. One of the myths about Kerala, this is an excerpt from an East India Company officer who came to fight with the East India Company troops at the age of 16 and rose through the ranks fighting alongside the general who was to go on to become the Duke of Wellington, who defeats Napoleon. He and the Duke of Wellington cuts his teeth fighting in the forests of northern Kerala, evolving techniques to fight against guerrilla warfare. So we're talking about all of these connections across the world, what Balakrishna Pillai always talks about. The world is a large connected place, and what we have are the narrow imaginations of ourselves being Malayalis, ourselves as being Indians, Germans, French, whatever it is. The world is the place that we need to think with. We need to think with the world rather than ourselves or the localities that we live in. So Walker Boland, for the first time, translates the myth of Kerala's origin, the Kerala Ulpatti, which he translates as the Kerala Udpatti. It's around the early 19th century. And these are the original manuscripts which are kept at the National Library of Scotland in Edinburgh. The myth goes that the sage Parashurama, who in answer to an affront to his father, the great sage, by a king, then vows to himself that he will slay 24 generations of warriors. So he takes upon himself this task as a Brahmin to slay the hubris of warriors, 24 generations. But he realizes that revenge is not satisfactory. And he realizes also that he needs to expiate for his sin. So he takes that bloodied axe and flings it into the ocean. The ocean retreats in horror. It cannot bear the weight of the sin. And as the ocean retreats in horror, the land is created, and Parashurama then begins to settle the land. This is the myth on which the founding of Kerala is imagined. And this is the first ever recording of that myth in English. But this idea that Kerala is a gift of the ocean, or rather arises from the horror of the ocean towards human action, is something that we need to think about also because it's a wonderful metaphor. What the ocean gave, the ocean can take away. Yeah? And there is that unfinished conquest of humans over nature which will constantly weigh on us. So in the end, what do we need to do? We need to think, we need to reflect. And when we reflect, and here again I turn to Balakrishna Pillai, because Balakrishna Pillai is somebody who always sat beside disciplines. Those of you who saw the film that was screened earlier know that he was one of the most prescient intellectuals of his time. He had read Proust in the 1930s. Proust had just been translated into English by Scott Moncrieff in the 1930s. And he had immediately read it in the small princely state of Travancore. In fact, Balakrishna Pillai read so much of Proust that he became a hypochondriac, very much the same way as Proust was. Proust, as you know, spent his life in a cork-lined room fearing illness. And Balakrishna Pillai was very much like that. So when you read his autobiographical notes, it's about how the weight of his body on his mind, that he can't step out before he falls unwell. But thought was what was allowed to him. And as we all know, the mind always exceeds the body that we inhabit. Our mind wanders. Our body doesn't need to wander. We don't need to go to Stockholm and Mongolia in order to see those places. Our mind can imagine through reading. So for him, thought was central. Thought was central at a point when India was dominated, India was subordinated to colonialism, and thought was what allowed him to free his imagination and generate a world for himself through creating affinities with Japanese thinkers, French thinkers, Italian thinkers, and so on. There's a lot of all of this in the film that preceded, but what I'm going to do here is to think through some things that I'm writing right now, which is on the 4 volumes of historical writing that Balakrishna Pillai produced. And here I'd like to concentrate on some of the themes that he speaks about, as well as some of the figures that he picks up, because, and I'll get to that in a while. So in 1944, he writes 3 articles on Adi Parashuraman. Parashuraman is the man, the sage who reclaimed Kerala from the sea. Adi Bharatam, meaning early India, and Adi Konkanam, which is the western coast. And he asks himself, if I am to write a history of this region, how am I to think this? Am I to think the history of this region with the historian's tools that have been provided to me? And for somebody who was a colonized subject, history was the tool of subjugation. He could not think with the discipline of history, which had indeed provided him nothing but a subordinate place in the space that he inhabited. It had taken away a sense of his individualism and provided him with mere subjectivity. So he asked, why are we still obsessed with proof and evidence in the imprecise social sciences like history, where a consideration of arguments made over a long durée, over a very long period, necessarily has to take an imaginative leap? So are we going to imprison ourselves with the disciplines that have been created through the destruction and the domination of humans over nature, or are we to step aside and reimagine what it would mean to think about the world, to think about nature, and to think about the human? And he argues that there was a reason why narratives about prehistory have been deficient. Despite the wide prevalence of flood stories in different cultures, there have been no attempt to forge a comparative method arising from the lack of an objective standpoint, nispakshamaya manasthiti. So he asks the question that any Malayali would ask, since the Malayali imagination is rooted in this idea of recovery of land from the ocean. He says, you look around you, whether you look at the Bible, whether you look at China, whether you look at the Middle East, there are flood myths everywhere. And these flood myths reflect the perilous conquest, the perilous, impermanent, and transient conquest of human beings over nature, because the flood can reclaim. And so we ask ourselves, when we write history, history cannot be written as the hubris of human advancement. History has to be written as the unfinished relation, the unfinished thinking of humans and humanity's relation with nature. The creation myth of Kerala allowed for a forging of affinities with societies across time and space through the idea of the flood, and the idea of the biblical flood became merely one instantiation within a larger space of the world. And because of that sense of affinity, of realizing that Kerala stood at the cusp of the world, it was also the portal into those other histories and imaginations, he reacted very strongly against a narrow nationalism that rested on the belief that the culture of one nation is ancient and superior to that of another, as also the belief that nations are swayambhu, self-generated, and are not beholden to anyone for their culture. So the idea that there was something called European culture, Indian culture, or the West and the East, and that these were not created through human interactions, created through imagination of affinities, created through movement of people, material, ideas, that he saw the world as a miscegenated space, right? Not as a place which had originally been pure and was now being brought into interaction under colonialism. So this idea that if we live in a world where our imaginations are always, already colliding with, generating new ideas, then we need to think about the world differently. That it has to be a common predicament and a common solution. Right? So when you think about the end of the world, the end of time, climate change, in the end it is all of us who have created the flood or who will create the flood to come. Therefore, we need to think together. So it is this question of affinity. And here again, this question of nationalism, the question of we are Europeans, we are Indians, we are Chinese, they are Russians, all of this doesn't allow us to think out of this common predicament. We have to imagine affinity. Affinity not only for other humans, but an affinity with animals, affinity with nature, affinity which is much larger than that which created the idea of civilization. Because the idea of civilization is premised on conquest over other humans, over nature, The idea of science is that which allows us to dominate nature, discover nature's regularities, and subordinate them to our intent. So this question of affinity was central to his work, and which is why Pillai did what he did. He read immensely. In one of the reasons why it's taken me so long, 10 years I've been working on this man, and I still haven't read half of what he has read, but he read over 40 years. So maybe at the age of 80, I'll produce my magnum opus on Pillai, but I'll have to read much faster. The names that I've put up here are names that are fairly unknown right now. I mean, who's heard of Joseph Strzygowski, right, who lived between 1862 to 1941? People like Aurel Stein, who worked on Buddhism. Vincenzo Ruggieri, right, who worked on Ethiopia. But for Pillai, it was necessary for him not to read the academic work that was important at that time, to read Marx, Durkheim, etc., etc. Through a leap of affinity, he had to think with people who had actually thought about the world as their oyster. So Joseph Strzygowski, who lived between 1862 and 1941, believed that when you think about European art, you have to think about the influence of the Near East. Those of you who know Giacometti's work will know that this is an instant metaphor that makes a lot of sense. These were figures who, as the academic Susan Marchand has argued, were engaged in an assault on the autonomy, unity, and tenacity of the classical world at the fin de siècle. In the late 19th century, people who were saying that this idea of Europe, the idea of the classical world, we have to think about it through the many influences that have flooded into Europe. So just to give you a simple example, there's a lot of work being done right now. When you think about the university, and the university in a sense of crisis, where does the idea of the college come to Europe? For those of you familiar with this, the idea of the college comes out of the madrasa. So as Europe goes into the Crusades in the 10th and the 11th century, those who went to fight in the Crusades encounter Saladin and a superior civilization. The first college is established in Europe by somebody who has returned from the Crusades, right? And these are the affinities that we need to think about. But Christopher Beckwith, who's a historian at Princeton, has shown that, look, we needn't stop the story here. So where did the madrasa come from? The Arabic madrasa. And he looks at the travels of Islam in Central Asia, where Islam encounters the detritus of a Buddhist civilization and the Buddhist vihara. So the vihara travels via Islam into the Middle East, and you have the madrasa, travels via the Crusades into the Europe, and you have the university. So we are left, if we at all, we engage with history seriously, we are left with a space which is always already miscegenated, where many cultures have come together in order to create these artificial entities in our minds of the West versus the East, of Asia versus Europe, rational Europe versus spiritual East, and so on and so forth. So Joseph Strzygowski was a figure at the end of the 19th century who was, as Susan Marchand puts it very precisely, who was engaged in this assault on the autonomy, unity, and tenacity of the idea of the classical world. This revolution in humanistic scholarship challenged the conviction of the educated elite in Europe that European culture was rooted exclusively in classical antiquity. The idea, that fictive genealogy that Europe creates, where Europe is derived from Greece. Suddenly, Egypt is left out of that narrative, right? So you have this leap that's made from Greek civilization to Europe. The Arab inheritance, the Egyptian inheritance is written out, as indeed in our spaces as we react with indigenous pride, and particularly under the present regime. The idea is that Indian civilization was created by Indians. Right? There's no contribution of Mughals who have come from outside, Europeans, they've come from outside, Buddhism, that came from outside, and so on and so forth. So this idea of Swayambhu, self-generated entities that Pillai was so strongly against. And Strzygowski insisted on Europe's dependence on Oriental forms, an enterprise that resonated with Balakrishna Pillai's rejection of differences between East and West, and the assumption of autarkic spaces, spaces which owe nothing to nobody, right? Like a self-made man, you have these self-made entities called nations. So again, we return to another word. So we've talked about affinity. We talk about another word, kinship. And kinship, again, has to be a much larger idea. It's not just a kinship between humans. Living in the Anthropocene, in the urgent conjuncture that we are, we have to imagine a kinship that's much wider than that between human and human alone. But there have been other imaginations. There have been other imaginations of the human which have always exceeded the nation, even as the nation was coming into existence. So at the end of the Second World War was when the former colonies all became nations. But interestingly enough, the end of the Second World War was when the Bandung Conference was held in 1955, when the nations of the decolonized world from Southeast Asia, from Africa, from India came together to say we have something in common that exceeds our subjection under colonialism and exceeds our imaginations of nationalism, right? That there is an affinity and a kinship that we have with each other, and this is something that, an idea that has kept recurring. So the Bandung idea has reproduced itself as the non-aligned world, it's reproduced itself as the global south, and it was sought to be reproduced by Goldman Sachs as BRICS formation, which is just a figment of international finance capital and bears very little relation to the histories of the movements of people and movements of ideas across these spaces. What strikes me about Kochi, to get back to the Biennale, is that when I look at the artists, as I go from room to room, and I've been here in 2012, 2014, 2016, I look at the artists whose work is on display, and I see this imagination being summoned up. It's like a seance, right, where you're summoning up these spirits of kinship that people have felt for the last 50, 100, 200 years, because you would think about that large Indian Ocean world, Arabs, Asians, Southeast Asians, Africans, all traded with each other, moved across these spaces. And here at the Biennale, as you go from room, what appears to be an unlikely juxtaposition of an Iranian artist next to a Chinese artist is actually summoning up a world that once used to exist, which we have forgotten. And so we have to think about that world, the world that we have lost, the imaginations that we have lost, and the idea of aspiration. And one thing, I mean, this I just, Kader Attia, whose work was on display called Independence Disillusionment, one of his works looks at all the stamps, postage stamps that were produced by African countries as they became independent in the 1960s and 70s. Most of them were influenced by 1969, man's landing on the moon, or a man, Neil Armstrong, about 3 men landing on the moon in 1969. So most of them imagined a future, which is a future that they couldn't possibly afford. Right? These were poor African countries, but coming in, gaining independence at the time that they did, they imagined an affinity with what the world was thinking at that point, as also a reaching out beyond the world into a cosmos, where in the end, there would be this idea of an engagement with other planets in the universe. And this seemed then to be merely utopian. As you know, Elon Musk is planning regular travel, right? People are already buying tickets for Mars and the moon and going to the moon and so on. And I'll end with, I've got another 15 minutes before I reach the limits of human tolerance, for listening that is. And so I'll briefly show you some exhibits from the Kochi Biennale, and which try and think outside of these ideas of empire, of nation, of these narrow entities into which we bind ourselves, right? Where we come into a space as Indians, as Greeks, and as Germans and so on, rather than as humans involved in the common predicament of humanity. And here I'm going to play for you a brief video. This is by the artist from Hong Kong, Kwang Sheng Chung. And this is something that he produced to reflect on that transition in 1999, when Hong Kong moves away from British sovereignty to China. And so where does Hong Kong belong? Is Hong Kong a space in the ocean where Indians, Chinese, Europeans all live? Or is Hong Kong now part of Chinese territory, under Chinese suzerainty. And he picks up on this idea, and he does a marvelous thing, which is to focus on the building in which his parents live, this tenement building in which his parents live. And his parents have hung out on the clothesline outside. Those of you who've been to Southeast Asia know that the clotheslines are projected outwards from the window. There's hardly any space in these buildings. And on the clotheslines are hung 3 flags. The flag of Britain, the flag of Hong Kong, and the flag of China, hung out to dry, as it were. And the parents are engaged in the task of pulling them in, as you would take in the washing. So in some sense, it's about this dirty linen that's being washed in public. And I'll play the video for you, and then you can reflect on what's happening here. So as you can see, there's mere cacophony, which is the result. As in this version of kitchen sink nationalism, these 3 flags are contending to keep in time with the rise and fall of these evocations of national sentiment. And what Guangsheng Qi does is to show us not only the hubris of national pride, but also to show the simultaneity of identities, that one can be Chinese, British, and so on at the same time, that these are not necessarily contending identities, these are co-present identities, that one oscillates between identities, that one is sometimes Indian, one is sometimes a person of the world, and so on and so forth. So when you think about these kinds of imaginations, it's interesting that there is a terrestrial imagination and there is a maritime imagination. The terrestrial imagination has been dominated by the idea of nation and of empire. The maritime imagination has always been the space of the open, fluid. So when Vasco da Gama rounds the Cape of Good Hope and he wants to find his way across to India, he consults Abdul Majid, who is this Arab navigator. At that point, the language of the sea is Arabic. Over 200 years, the language of the sea would become Portuguese when the Portuguese ruled the waves. And then over a period of time, it would become English. But these would be a mere overlay of the multiple languages that were spoken along the ocean, ranging from Gujarati to Sinhalese to Tamil to Czech to Polish and so on and so forth. Right? So the maritime space has been one in which human beings have always found affinities with one another, and which alerts us also to what the ocean allows us to do. The ocean has been the space through which people have migrated voluntarily. The ocean has been the space through which slaves have been transported forcibly from Africa to the US and Britain. The ocean has been the space through which, with the end of slavery, that new trick that was perpetrated on humanity, indentured laborers travel. But the ocean has always been the space across which people move as they imagine affinities, achieve ambitions, and establish histories elsewhere. So if you think about that metaphor of what is the United States, it's a nation comprised of people who have come from elsewhere, who have moved across the ocean. And here, Adrian Paci, the video that I'm going to show you now, Adrian Paci, the Albanian artist, in this video shows us the ocean as a space in which the uncanny, the mysterious, and a space in which Europe is invented by people from elsewhere. So what you have is Chinese laborers working on a ship that is going across the ocean from China to Europe. and they are
came
forging
to me
classic.
like a fairy tale, you know, like a sculpture produced in the boat, you know, during the trip. But the fairy tale was this idea of, you know, a sculpture, so somehow an art piece produced in this in the middle of the ocean, you know. But at the same time, this model coming from the west that goes to the east and then it's coming back to the west in this travel, but very close to this fairy tale thing. It was the hardness of the reality.
So you have these Chinese laborers creating cheaply for Europe the glories of its civilization. Right? So you have the Doric, Ionian, Corinthian pillars, which will be established as the wonders of classical Europe, but they're being made in transit because it's cheaper to actually create them in transit. So when you start off with blocks of marble at one end, and you reach the other end, the pillars are complete. Of course, no one cares much for these unnamed laborers who labor in the sun. Remember that there's no shelter. They're working in the heat. And it's a bit like when we think about the middle passage of slavery from Africa to Europe, this is another passage of slavery that's being enacted. So it's a slavery of wage labor perhaps, but here again, what is Europe? What is China? Who creates Europe for Europe is a question that this raises. And to get back to this idea of migration, when we think about the present conjuncture that we are in, where the Middle East has been devastated, and we've all seen images of children being washed ashore on the shores of Europe, Turkey, Syria, waves upon waves of migration that are happening from the Middle East and North Africa into Europe. What is interesting when we think about that migration that is happening, when we think about the migration of labor across the world, and here I put before you the map of what is called the migration of the first anatomically modern humans. And you can see how they're all moving out of Africa, going all the way to South America and so on, up into Europe, into Asia, into Australia. Now, if you look at a contemporary map of migration, some of the world's more important current migration routes, there isn't much difference, right? You could move between this and label one as the other. And there's something about human migration that has always exceeded these false boundaries that we have drawn of the European Union, of India, of the United States of America. There is an impulse within humans to cross rivers. If there is a boulder, you go over it. If there is water, you swim across it. But you get across to the other side. And when we think about this fundamental fact of migration that has governed human existence, how possible is it to hang on to our pure ideas of nation, of territory, of identities, and so on, when what we have is this space that has been created through a miscegenation across centuries, across thousands of years? And so, when we think where we stand about the world, how it was created, who are we, what are we to do in the present conjuncture? Will the flood happen again? Will we let it happen? Will we step back from the brink? We also have to think about what is the relation between the past, the future, and the present. To go back to Marie Belardi's slide where she showed us those islands, some of those islands, even as you look at the slide, are ceasing to exist. It's present continuous. Some have ceased to exist. Some will cease to exist, and so on. So it seems like a fluid transition between these categories of tenses, right, which doesn't make us as tense as we should be when you consider the state of the world. And to end with Walter Benjamin, again, this is one from a quotation from the Arcades Project and one from his idea of the concept of history, where he asks ourselves, what is our responsibility to the past? Right? We tend to ask ourselves, what is our responsibility to the future? And what Benjamin is asking us to do is that if we are to think urgently about the present, we have to know that things have happened before which we weren't up to resolving. We have a responsibility to the past precisely because that past is a site of debris, is a site of ruin. When we look at the past, what we see is the detritus of human hubris. So when we look at the past has left images of itself in literary texts, images comparable to those which are imprinted by light on a photosensitive plate. The future alone possesses developers active enough to scan such surfaces perfectly. So what appears to us to be a cloudy print left to us from the past, we have a responsibility to develop that. This was the great age of photography in which he was writing. So he saw us as developers of the negatives that the past has handed on to us, which are blurred. We do not know what they contain, but our responsibility lies, our retroactive responsibility lies in developing those prints so that we can tell ourselves, this was the ruin that we created, but this is not the ruin that we shall create. The past carries with it a temporal index by which it is referred to redemption. There is a secret agreement between past generations and the present one. Our coming was expected on earth. Like every generation that preceded us, we have been endowed with a weak messianic power, a power to which the past has a claim. Each of us stands in the relation of a Messiah to what has happened in the past, because we have to remember. We cannot afford ignorance. We have to think with notions of affinity. We have to tell ourselves that the ruin of the past is our responsibility, not out of a sense of tragedy, but out of a sense of utopia. We are the messiahs that will create that future, which will not merely be debris. The next time, it will not be the flood. It will be thought that will prevent the flood. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Professor, I agree with you that Buddhism came back to India later, but there was a period when that was the religion of India. Thanks to Shankaracharya and others, it sort of retreated. To what do you attribute this retreat? I think it's a great religion. I'm not a Buddhist, but I think it's a really great religion. What really caused its decline in India? It's there all over the world. What caused its decline in India?
Wow, that's way beyond the scope of what I said, and it will probably, but if I were to give an answer in a nutshell, I mean, since there is a responsibility in these times to answer every question, right? We cannot elide questions. And one of the major reasons why Buddhism declined as it did is that when we think about the idea of decline also, we need to think about, so there are two things I would like to say. One, when we think about the idea of decline, we need to think about it in a more complicated fashion. So even as Buddhism, as a result of political transformation, the rise of Hindu monarchies, the reaction of Indian philosophical traditions, right? Buddhism is on the wane in India, Buddhism expands outside. Right? It finds its way to China, it finds its way to Japan, it finds its way to Sri Lanka and elsewhere. So that when I went to Japan, the first thing that the word by which they refer to India is as Western heaven, right? The place from which Buddhism originated. So the decline of Buddhism has to do with the reaction of a hierarchical society to a religion that offered the possibility of equality. And Buddhism doesn't go away. Buddhism comes back. In the late 19th century, you have the resurgence of ideas of Buddhism all over southern India, which is where the first self-respect movements are inaugurated by lower castes. So you have the Tamil thinker Yotidas beginning to write about Buddhism, and you have B.R. Ambedkar, the leader of the former untouchables, who was the architect of our constitution in 1956, deciding that he will become Buddhist along with more than 100,000 of his untouchable Dalit followers. So it keeps coming back, right? And I think what we are seeing here is that whenever you have societies that begin to congeal around ideas of the majority, right, you will always have these visions of emancipation that resurface. And in fact, in 1956, 1947 was when India became independent. 1950 was when the Constitution was promulgated, promising equality to all Indians. 1956, the architect of that Constitution realized that equality is written in every page of the Constitution, but doesn't exist outside of it. Right? So he converts to Buddhism. So what we are looking at here is this constant resurgence, the re-emergence of imaginations which promised emancipation. And similarly, when I look at the Kochi Biennale and I think about Mari Velarde's work, when I think about work which is referencing, right, history, the flood, it's important to think about why are these imaginations surfacing? Because we realize we are standing at the edge of a precipice and we are reaching back to that past. As Benjamin told us, we're reaching back to the past for those undeveloped photographic plates, and we are developing them frantically, hoping to find a solution. So Buddhism is one such imagination, which is never declined, right? Which should have been the short answer, but then one has to have a process of thinking that gets us to that. Thank you.
Thank you.
So if we are talking about, and if I understand you right, a consolidated sense of identity as human beings and a larger humanity, globally, with all of us, I think we need to develop and inculcate, which goes beyond race, religion, nationalism, and so on and so forth. In your mind, how do you address things like more mundane, more more pragmatic issues like governance and societal development and nation building maybe is a tool in order to actually achieve these things in a utopian reality or let's say a future where we're able to identify with each other as human beings beyond other markers. How would we self-govern, or is that a possibility, or are there ideas around that?
Yeah, I mean, it's that kind of the question that you're asking, which is more related to the present, related to what we have. As Kant once said, out of the crooked timber of humanity, nothing straight has ever been made. So when you think about the fact that we have to live with governments, we also have to think about times when governments were not conceived in the ways that we know of them now, right? Of governments that govern over citizens and over a notion of territory that is national, which is why very briefly I gave you that glimpse of the Bandung Conference in 1955, where even at the point that nations were coming into existence, they knew that that need not exhaust the imagination of human potential, right? Where all of those leaders at that time, if you read the documents of the Bandung Conference, it drew intellectuals from all over the world, like Richard Wright traveled from the United States to report on the Bandung Conference and think about the hope it offered for African Americans in the United States of America. And the Bandung Conference generated the possibility that governments were for governing, right? But they were not about the regulation of the imagination, nor indeed to narrow the possibility of a universal responsibility that every human being needs to address. So it is again, when I look back to Bandung right now, it is again a Benjaminian reaching back to the past. It's like we were talking about Buddhism earlier. You reach back to the past to address a crisis of the present. And we are surrounded now by regimes like the present regime in India, the present regime in the United States, the present regime in Turkey. But we also know that there are other imaginations that surface as human beings reach back to a sense of affinity, a sense of kinship, and a belief in certain ideals of what ought to govern relations between humans, and that we cannot afford ignorance. And it's very interesting that that question that the Yaksha asked of Yudhishthira or of the Pandavas, what is the greatest crime of humans? And Yudhishthira answers ignorance. In a universe in which the idea of the post-fact has become something that is or alternative facts has become something that is being talked about. That is precisely what the idea of the crime of ignorance addresses, that we cannot afford to be ignorant. We have to keep talking and we have to keep learning. Yeah, so I'll stop there.
Thank you.